The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped locker room as Sarah Martinez pulled on her workout clothes. Around her, the conversations flowed with the casual cruelty that seemed to follow her everywhere on the base. The other trainees didn't bother lowering their voices anymore. "I heard she's only here because they need to fill some diversity quota," whispered Jackson, a burly guy from Texas who'd made it clear from day one that he thought women had no place in special operations training. "Yeah, probably wash out in the first week of real training," added Rodriguez, not even glancing in Sarah's direction as he laced up his boots. "My sister couldn't even handle basic boot camp, and she was tougher than most girls." Sarah kept her face neutral, focusing on tying her shoelaces with the same precision she applied to everything else. At 28, she'd learned that responding to ignorance only gave it more power. But the comments still stung, especially when they came from people who had no idea what she'd already survived. The thing about assumptions was that people made them based on what they could see. They saw a woman who was 5'6" and weighed maybe 130 soaking wet. They saw someone who looked like she belonged in an office rather than rappelling down buildings or swimming through freezing ocean water in full gear. What they didn't see was the steel that had been forged in her bones through years of training they couldn't imagine. "I give her 3 days before she's crying to go home," laughed Thompson, the loudest of the group. He was the kind of guy who'd probably been the high school quarterback and never quite got over it. "This isn't some feel-good movie where the underdog wins. This is real life." Sarah stood up, shouldering her gear bag with movements that spoke of countless hours of practice. She could have told them about the sleepless nights she'd spent studying tactical manuals while they were probably drinking beer and playing video games. She could have mentioned the thousands of miles she'd run before dawn, or the way her hands no longer shook when she assembled weapons in complete darkness. Instead, she walked toward the door, her footsteps silent despite the heavy boots. As she reached for the handle, Jackson called out one more time. "Hey, Martinez. When you quit, make sure you don't slam the door too hard. Some of us are trying to get ready for actual training." The laughter that followed her out was sharp and dismissive, the kind that was meant to cut deep and leave scars. Sarah let the door close softly behind her, the sound barely audible above their continuing jokes. Outside, the California sun was already climbing toward its peak, promising another day of temperatures that would push everyone to their limits. The training facility stretched out before her like a concrete maze designed by someone who understood that comfort was the enemy of growth. Obstacle courses wound between buildings that looked more like warehouses than anything meant for human habitation. Other trainees were already gathering near the main building, their conversations a low murmur of nervous energy and forced confidence. Sarah recognized the type from her years in the military. Most of them were good soldiers who'd excelled in their regular units and thought they were ready for the next level. A few were adrenaline junkies who'd watched too many movies and confused Hollywood drama with reality. All of them were about to discover exactly how much they didn't know about pushing human limits. Commander Phillips emerged from the building with the kind of presence that made conversations stop mid-sentence. He was a man who'd clearly spent years turning discipline into an art form, and his eyes swept over the assembled group with the calculating gaze of someone who could spot weakness from 50 yards away. "Listen up, people," his voice carried across the courtyard without any apparent effort. "You're here because someone somewhere thought you might have what it takes to join the most elite fighting force in the world. Most of you are wrong." Sarah found herself standing slightly apart from the main group, not by choice but because the others had unconsciously created space around her. It was a familiar pattern, one that had followed her through most of her military career. Being different made people uncomfortable, and, when people were uncomfortable, they created distance. "Over the next several weeks, we're going to strip away every comfortable assumption you have about yourselves," Phillips continued, his gaze moving systematically from face to face. "We're going to push you past every limit you think you have, and then, we're going to push you further. Some of you will discover reserves of strength you never knew existed. Most of you will discover exactly where your breaking point lies." When his eyes reached Sarah, they paused for just a fraction of a second longer than they had with the others. It wasn't disapproval or doubt she saw there, but something more like curiosity. As if he was wondering what story lay behind her decision to be here. "The ocean doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your personal motivations," Phillips said, and, though he was addressing the entire group, Sarah felt like he was speaking directly to her. Bullets don't discriminate. When your team is depending on you to get them home alive, the only thing that matters is whether you can do the job. The first exercise was deceptively simple. A 2-mile run followed by a swim across the bay and back. Nothing that any of them hadn't done before in some variation. But Sarah knew from experience that it was never about the individual components. It was about how you performed when everything was stacked against you, when your body was screaming for rest and your mind was looking for excuses to quit. As they lined up at the starting line, Thompson made sure to position himself right next to her. "Try to keep up, sweetheart," he said with a grin that was meant to look friendly but carried an edge of mockery. "I'd hate for you to get lost out there." Sarah didn't respond, but she made note of his number and his pace as they started running. Some lessons were better taught through demonstration than words, and she had a feeling Thompson was about to receive an education he wasn't expecting. The run started easy enough, with most of the trainees settling into a comfortable pace that felt sustainable. Sarah hung back initially, letting the eager ones surge ahead while she found her rhythm. Running had always been meditation for her, a time when the noise in her head could quiet down and everything became about breath and heartbeat and the steady rhythm of feet against ground. By the 1-mile mark, the pack had started to spread out. The sprinters who'd gone out too fast were beginning to fade, their breathing becoming labored as they discovered the difference between wanting to be fast and having trained to be fast. Sarah began moving up through the field, her pace steady and controlled. Thompson was still running strong, about 10 yards ahead of her and clearly trying to make a point about maintaining his lead. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't racing him yet. She was studying him, watching how he moved when he thought he was winning versus how he might move when things got difficult. The real test would come in the water. Running was something anyone could train for with enough time and dedication. Swimming in open ocean while exhausted was something else entirely. It required a different kind of mental toughness, the ability to stay calm when your lungs were burning and the shore seemed impossibly far away. As they reached the beach, Sarah was running in 5th place overall, close enough to the leaders to make her move when it mattered but not so close that she'd expended unnecessary energy getting there. The transition from land to water would separate the prepared from the hopeful, and she'd spent years getting ready for moments exactly like this. The Pacific was colder than it looked from shore, the kind of cold that hit like a physical blow and made every instinct scream about getting out immediately. Sarah dove in without hesitation, her body adjusting to the temperature shock with the efficiency of long practice. Around her, she could hear gasps and curses as the others hit the water, their pace immediately slowing as they fought against both the cold and their body's natural resistance. This was where her real training showed. While the others struggled to find a rhythm in the unfamiliar environment, Sarah's stroke was smooth and powerful, cutting through the water with minimal splash or wasted motion. She'd learned to swim in conditions far worse than this, in water so cold that exposure suits were mandatory and waves that could break bones if you weren't careful. By the time she reached the halfway point, she'd moved into 2nd place. Thompson was still ahead, but his stroke had become ragged and his breathing pattern suggested he was working much harder than he'd planned. The swim back to shore would tell the real story about who had prepared for this moment and who had simply hoped their natural athleticism would be enough. As they turned to head back, Sarah made her move. Her kick intensified, her stroke rate increased, and she began closing the gap with a precision that spoke of countless hours spent training for exactly this scenario. Thompson glanced over as she pulled alongside him, his eyes widening slightly as he realized she wasn't struggling the way he'd expected. "How you doing, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, her breathing controlled despite the pace they were maintaining. It was the first time she'd spoken to him directly, and the casual way she threw his own words back at him carried a message that was impossible to miss. Thompson tried to respond, but he was working too hard to waste breath on conversation. His stroke became more frantic as he attempted to match her pace, but desperation was a poor substitute for preparation. By the time the shore came back into view, Sarah had pulled into a clear lead, her form still smooth and efficient while others struggled just to maintain forward progress. She emerged from the water in 1st place overall, her time fast enough to turn heads among the instructors who'd been watching from the beach. As she stood there, water streaming from her wetsuit, the other trainees began struggling onto shore behind her. Thompson came in fourth, his face red with exertion and something that might have been embarrassment. The locker room was quiet when they returned, the earlier bravado replaced by the thoughtful silence that came after assumptions had been challenged. Sarah changed out of her wet clothes with the same methodical precision she'd shown during the exercise, aware that conversations were happening around her but no longer the target of open mockery. But she knew this was just the beginning. One good performance might quiet the doubts temporarily, but it wouldn't erase them. Real respect in a place like this wasn't earned through a single demonstration. It was built through consistency, through showing up day after day and proving that excellence wasn't an accident but a choice. As she gathered her gear to leave, Jackson approached her with an expression that was harder to read than his earlier hostility had been. "Nice swim out there," he said, and, for the first time, it sounded like he meant it. "Maybe I was wrong about the 3-day thing." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of the comment but didn't smile or offer false friendship in return. She'd learned that respect given grudgingly could be taken away just as easily, and she had no intention of making things comfortable for people who'd been comfortable dismissing her. "See you tomorrow," she said simply, shouldering her bag and heading for the door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and probably new attempts to find her breaking point. But tonight, she'd go home to her small apartment off base, review her training notes, and prepare for whatever came next with the same methodical approach that had gotten her this far. The men in the locker room didn't know it yet, but they'd just met someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. Someone who understood that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. And someone who had no intention of giving them any more reasons to doubt her capabilities. 3 weeks into training, the dynamics had shifted but the underlying tensions remained. Sarah had consistently placed in the top 3 in every physical challenge, from rope climbing to obstacle courses to the brutal log carries that left even the strongest men gasping. Her marksmanship scores were flawless, her tactical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her ability to remain calm under pressure had become something the instructors pointed to as an example for others. But excellence, she was learning, could be just as isolating as failure. "She's making the rest of us look bad," she overheard Williams complaining to a small group during their brief rest period. They were halfway through what the instructors cheerfully called Hell Week, though it bore little resemblance to the sanitized version civilians might imagine from movies. This was methodical, scientific torture designed to find exactly where each person's spirit would break. "I'm telling you, there's something weird about it," Thompson added, his voice carrying the frustrated edge of someone who'd been forced to re-evaluate everything he thought he knew. "Normal people don't perform like that under this kind of stress. She's either on something, or she's not telling us something about her background." Sarah kept her breathing steady as she worked on cleaning her weapon, but, internally, she was calculating. Thompson wasn't entirely wrong to be suspicious. Her performance wasn't normal, because her background wasn't what any of them assumed. But the truth was something she couldn't share, not yet, not until the time was right. The irony was that she'd volunteered for this training program knowing she was already overqualified. While her fellow trainees were experiencing SEAL preparation for the first time, she was essentially going through an extended refresher course. But explaining that would require revealing information that could compromise everything she was trying to accomplish. Commander Phillips appeared at the edge of their rest area with the silent efficiency that had become his trademark. "Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying the flat tone that meant business. "A word." She followed him away from the group, aware that their conversation was being watched with intense curiosity by everyone within sight. Phillips had a reputation for not wasting words, so when he asked for private discussions, people paid attention. "You're not struggling," he said once they were out of earshot. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze directly. She'd learned early in her career that trying to downplay her abilities usually backfired. Better to be honest and deal with the consequences. This level of training is designed to break people down and build them back up. It's supposed to push everyone past their comfort zone. Phillips studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "But you're not being pushed past anything. You're performing like someone who's done this before." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This was the conversation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure.
How much could she reveal without compromising the larger mission? How much truth could she tell without changing everything about how she was perceived?
I've had extensive training, sir, she said carefully. Different context, but similar principles.
What kind of context?
The question hung in the air between them like a landmine waiting to be triggered.
Sarah made a decision that would either advance her mission or end it completely. The kind that's classified above your clearance level, sir.
I'm here on special assignment, and I need to complete this training to maintain my cover for the next phase of the operation. Phillips's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The calculating look of an instructor evaluating a student was replaced by something more complex. He was processing information, running possibilities through his mind with the speed of someone who'd spent years dealing with situations where not everything was as it seemed.
How long have you been operational? He asked finally. 8 years active duty, sir. 3 years in my current assignment. Current assignment being? I command a classified special operations unit. I'm here because my next mission requires me to have official SEAL certification. The Pentagon decided it would be easier to put me through the standard program than to create a paper trail that might raise questions later.
The silence stretched between them as Phillips absorbed this information. Sarah could practically see him running through the implications, considering what her presence here meant for his program and, for the other trainees who had no idea they were competing against someone who was already everything they were trying to become.
The other candidates don't know, he stated. No, sir. And it needs to stay that way until training is complete.
They need to fail or succeed on their own merits, not because they're trying to measure themselves against someone with 8 years of special operations experience.
Phillips nodded slowly.
That explains a few things.
Your tactical knowledge is too advanced for someone coming in from regular military. Your stress responses are too controlled. You move like someone who's been in combat. I have been, sir. More than I'd like to count. And the attitude from the other trainees?
You're letting them disrespect you when you could shut it down in about 5 seconds.
Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Respect that's demanded isn't worth much, sir.
If they can't see past their assumptions to recognize competence when it's demonstrated, that says more about them than it does about me. Besides, being underestimated has tactical advantages.
You're using this as a learning experience for them. In part. They're going to be SEALs, assuming they make it through.
At some point, they're going to encounter situations where their preconceptions put them at a disadvantage.
Better they learn that lesson here than in the field where it might get people killed.
Phillips was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the obstacle course where other trainees were struggling through rope climbs and mud crawls. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect.
What's your actual rank? Lieutenant Commander. Jesus.
The word slipped out before he could stop it, and, for the first time since she'd met him, Commander Phillips looked genuinely surprised.
You outrank me. On paper.
But, this is your house, sir, and I'm here as a student.
The rank doesn't matter unless someone's life is in immediate danger. And, your unit? What kind of operations? Sarah hesitated.
There were levels of classification that even a SEAL training commander wasn't cleared for, and she was already walking a fine line by revealing as much as she had. But, Phillips needed to understand why she was there, and partial truth was often more dangerous than complete honesty.
Counter-terrorism. Deep cover operations. The kind of missions that officially never happen.
My team specializes in situations where conventional special forces can't operate effectively.
Because of your gender. Among other things.
There are places in the world where a woman can go that a man can't, conversations I can have that would be impossible for male operatives.
My team is built around that capability.
Phillips processed this information with the methodical approach of someone who understood that in the special operations world, nothing was ever as simple as it appeared on the surface. Sarah could see him working through the implications, considering how her presence here might affect his training program and what responsibilities he now carried. The Pentagon sent you here without telling me, he said finally.
That's interesting politics. They needed someone with special operations credentials to evaluate the current SEAL training program. Whether the standards are adequate for the kind of threats we're facing now. My successful completion of the program serves multiple purposes. And, if you don't complete it? Sarah's smile was sharp and humorless. I will complete it, sir. Failure isn't an option in my line of work. They walked back toward the group in comfortable silence, both of them aware that the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. Phillips now understood that he wasn't just training a promising candidate, he was working with a peer who was here on a mission that extended far beyond earning a SEAL qualification. The afternoon brought underwater demolitions training, one of the most technically demanding aspects of the program. It required not just physical capability but the kind of mental discipline that could maintain focus while working with explosives in an environment where a single mistake could be fatal. Sarah found herself paired with Jackson for the exercise, which involved placing charges on a simulated ship hull while swimming in full gear 30 feet below the surface. Jackson had been one of her more persistent critics early in training, though his hostility had evolved into grudging respect as her performance made his initial assumptions impossible to maintain. You know what the others are saying about you, he said as they checked their equipment before entering the water. I know what they were saying, Sarah replied, testing the seal on her breathing apparatus. I assume it's evolved since then. They think you're some kind of special projects candidate. That you're here for reasons that aren't normal. Jackson's tone was conversational, but Sarah could hear the underlying question. He was fishing for information, trying to reconcile what he'd observed with what made sense given his understanding of how military training usually worked. What do you think? She asked instead of answering directly. Jackson was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. I think you perform like someone who's done this before. Not just similar training, but specifically this. Your confidence isn't the kind that comes from natural ability or good preparation. It's the kind that comes from experience. And that bothers you? It confuses me. If you already have this level of capability, why are you here with the rest of us? Why put yourself through training for skills you obviously already possess? Sarah finished her equipment check and turned to face him directly. Maybe because having the skills and having the certification are two different things. Maybe because there are aspects of my career that require official credentials that can't be questioned or investigated too closely. That sounds like spy movie bullshit. Does it? Sarah's tone remained neutral, but something in her expression made Jackson take a step back. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of something that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of her professional demeanor. Something cold and dangerous that spoke of experiences far outside the normal range of military service. Jesus, he said quietly. What exactly do you do? Right now, I'm a SEAL trainee learning underwater demolitions. That's all you need to know. The dive went smoothly, with Sarah and Jackson working together to place their charges according to the tactical plan they developed during the briefing. Underwater, with communication limited to hand signals and shared objectives, Jackson discovered that working with someone of her caliber was entirely different from working with even the most capable of their fellow trainees. Her movements were economical and precise, with no wasted motion or unnecessary risks. She communicated clearly, adapted quickly to changing conditions, and maintained perfect awareness of time, depth, and mission parameters without any apparent effort. Most importantly, she worked as part of a team rather than trying to demonstrate individual superiority. When they surfaced after successfully completing the exercise, Jackson's perspective on her had shifted once again. Working closely with someone revealed things that observation from a distance couldn't capture, and what he discovered was that Sarah Martinez was operating on a completely different level from everyone else in the program. You've done this for real, he said as they swam back to shore. It wasn't a question. Multiple times, Sarah replied without hesitation. There was no point in denying what had become obvious during their underwater work. In conditions that made this look like a swimming pool exercise. Combat operations? That's classified. Jackson nodded, understanding that he'd reached the limit of what she was willing or able to share.
But the brief conversation had answered questions that had been bothering him for weeks, and had raised new ones about exactly who Sarah Martinez was and why she was really there. That evening, the locker room atmosphere had changed yet again. Word of Sarah's performance during the demolitions exercise had spread through the group, and the casual dismissiveness of the early weeks had been replaced by something more complicated. Respect mixed with curiosity, admiration tempered by confusion about her true background. Thompson approached her as she was gathering her gear, his expression serious rather than confrontational. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and, when she nodded, he continued. "Are you actually here to become a SEAL, or are you here for some other reason?" Sarah considered her response carefully. The truth was still too sensitive to share completely, but she owed these men something approaching honesty. They were good soldiers who deserved better than to be kept completely in the dark about what they were dealing with. "I'm here to complete SEAL training and earn my qualification," she said finally. "The reasons why I need that qualification are complicated, but my commitment to finishing this program is absolute. You don't have to worry about me quitting or washing out. I'll be here until the end. And, after that? After that, I go back to my regular assignment. Which is something I can't talk about." Thompson nodded slowly, processing this information. "The others think you're some kind of test case. That the Navy is using you to see if women can handle this level of training. What do you think?" "I think you're already everything we're trying to become, and you're here for reasons that are way above our pay grade." Thompson's honesty was refreshing after weeks of speculation and sideways comments. "I think we've been focusing on the wrong questions. What should we be focusing on? Learning everything we can from someone who's already where we want to be. If you're willing to teach, some of us are ready to listen." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. This was what she'd been hoping for, the moment when her fellow trainees would stop seeing her as an anomaly and start recognizing her as a resource. "I can share what I've learned," she said. "But it goes both ways. You've all got strengths and perspectives that I can benefit from too. That's how teams work." "Teams? We're all going to be SEALs when this is over. That makes us teammates, regardless of where we started or why we're here. The mission comes first, and the mission requires all of us to be at our best." As she left the locker room that night, Sarah felt like she'd crossed an important threshold. The foundation of mutual respect was finally being built, and the group dynamics were evolving in ways that would benefit everyone's training and eventual operational effectiveness. But she also knew that the real challenges were still ahead. Her secret assignment was about more than just completing SEAL training, and the next phase of her mission would require skills and judgment that went far beyond what any training program could teach. The alarm screamed through the barracks at 0300 hours, 6 weeks into what was supposed to be their final phase of training. Sarah was awake before the sound reached full volume, her body responding to the alert with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd been awakened by similar alarms in hostile territory where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Around her, the other trainees stumbled out of their bunks with varying degrees of alertness. Some had learned to wake up ready for action, while others still needed precious seconds to orient themselves and remember where they were. In real operations, those seconds could cost lives. "This is not a drill," Commander Phillips's voice crackled over the intercom system with an urgency that cut through any lingering drowsiness. "All personnel report to Briefing Room Alpha immediately. Combat gear, full loadout." Sarah was dressed and equipped while most of her teammates were still trying to find their boots. She'd learned long ago that preparation wasn't just about having the right gear, it was about being able to access and deploy that gear under any conditions, at any time, without conscious thought. Jackson was the first to join her in the hallway, his movements sharp and focused despite the early hour. The weeks of training together had created a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills. He was strong, reliable, and had developed an intuitive understanding of small unit tactics that made him an ideal point man. "Real world?" he asked quietly as they moved toward the briefing room. "Has to be," Sarah replied, her mind already shifting into operational mode. Training scenarios don't pull people out of bed at 3 in the morning with full combat loads. Thompson and Williams caught up with them as they reached the briefing room, both men moving with the controlled urgency that marked them as serious professionals despite their earlier attitudes. The weeks of training had burned away most of the casual prejudices and replaced them with the kind of focus that came from shared hardship and mutual dependence. The briefing room was packed with more than just their training class. Sarah recognized instructors, support staff, and several faces she didn't know but whose bearing marked them as active duty operators. This wasn't a graduation exercise or a final exam. This was something real, something immediate, and something that required every available asset. Commander Phillips stood at the front of the room with a tension in his posture that spoke of serious stakes and limited time. Behind him, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of what looked like an industrial compound surrounded by desert terrain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a developing situation," Phillips began without preamble. 47 minutes ago, a group of armed militants seized control of a natural gas processing facility in the Permian Basin. They're holding 18 American workers hostage and have threatened to detonate the facility if their demands aren't met. The room went completely silent as everyone processed this information. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not with anxiety but with the familiar alertness that came when training became reality. She'd been in similar situations before, though never as part of a group that included trainees. The facility contains enough liquefied natural gas to level everything within a 5-mile radius if they follow through on their threat, Phillips continued. Local law enforcement is overwhelmed, the FBI's hostage rescue team is 3 hours out, and we have reason to believe the militants have inside knowledge of the facility's security systems. Williams raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, are we being briefed on this for educational purposes, or?" "You're being briefed because you're the closest qualified personnel to the target site," Phillips cut him off. "The base has been tasked with providing immediate response capability, and that means everyone who's completed weapons and tactics training." "Which includes all of you." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, but recognition of a situation that was spiraling beyond normal parameters. Training classes didn't get deployed to active hostage situations unless something had gone seriously wrong with the standard response protocols. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone with operational experience. "What's the intelligence picture? Do we know who these militants are, what their capabilities are, or what their actual objectives might be?" Phillips's eyes found hers across the room, and she could see that he was thinking the same thing she was. This situation was moving too fast, with too little information, and too many unknowns. In her experience, that combination usually meant someone was making decisions based on political pressure rather than tactical reality. "Intelligence is limited," Phillips admitted. "The group hasn't been identified, their demands are vague, and the facility's security systems went dark 30 minutes after the initial breach. What we do know is that they're armed with military-grade weapons and they've demonstrated knowledge of the facility's critical systems." "Inside help," Thompson said grimly. "Has to be. That's our assessment as well. Which means standard hostage rescue protocols may not apply. We have to assume they know we're coming and they've prepared accordingly." Sarah's mind was racing through tactical possibilities and operational constraints. A natural gas facility presented unique challenges for any kind of assault. The threat of explosion limited the use of certain weapons and tactics, while the industrial environment provided both cover and deadly hazards for anyone operating inside. "What's our mission parameters?" she asked, noting that several of the instructors were looking at her with expressions that suggested they expected her to take a leadership role. "Reconnaissance and assessment initially," Phillips replied. "But we need to be prepared to escalate to direct action if the situation deteriorates. The facility goes critical in approximately 6 hours if the cooling systems aren't restored." Jackson leaned over and whispered, "This is way above our pay grade. We're still trainees." But Sarah was no longer thinking like a trainee. The familiar weight of command responsibility was settling on her shoulders, and she could feel her mind shifting into the tactical planning mode that had kept her alive through dozens of similar situations. "Sir," she said, standing up with a confidence that commanded attention from everyone in the room. "I need to speak with you privately before we proceed with mission planning." Phillips nodded curtly.
Everyone else, gear check and prepare for deployment. Transport leaves in 30 minutes. Martinez, with me.
They stepped into a smaller briefing room where Phillips closed the door and activated a white noise generator. When he turned back to her, his expression was grim. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," he said without preamble. "This smells like a setup," Sarah replied. "Too many coincidences, too little intelligence, and way too much pressure for immediate action. In my experience, that combination usually means someone wants us to fail. Or someone wants to see how you handle yourself in a real-world scenario." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place in her mind. This isn't a coincidental emergency. This is a test. A final examination that uses real stakes to evaluate performance under actual pressure. "I can't confirm or deny that," Phillips said carefully. "But I can tell you that the hostages are real, the threat is real, and the consequences of failure are real. Whatever the ultimate purpose of this operation, people's lives are at stake. And you need someone with actual operational experience to make sure this doesn't turn into a disaster. The trainees in that room are good soldiers, but none of them have commanded anything more complex than a squad-level exercise. You've run actual operations. If this goes sideways, they're going to need leadership from someone who knows the difference between training scenarios and combat reality." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking her to do. "You want me to take operational command. I want you to do whatever is necessary to bring everyone home alive and complete the mission successfully. How you accomplish that is up to you." They rejoined the group to find organized chaos as the trainees prepared for their first real-world deployment. Weapons were being cleaned and checked, communications equipment was being tested, and everyone was running through mental checklists with the focused intensity of professionals who understood the stakes. But Sarah could also see the underlying tension and uncertainty. These were good soldiers who'd excelled in training, but training and reality were different animals entirely. The knowledge that actual lives hung in the balance changed everything about how decisions had to be made and risks had to be calculated. "Listen up," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to establish operational protocols before we leave this room." The conversation stopped instantly as everyone turned to look at her. For the first time since training had begun, she wasn't hiding her experience or downplaying her capabilities. This was Sarah Martinez operating at full capacity, and the transformation was striking enough to make several people take a step back. "Thompson, you're on point for building clearing. Jackson, you'll coordinate communications and maintain contact with command. Williams, I need you managing equipment and logistics. Rodriguez, you're our designated marksman and overwatch coordinator." The assignments came naturally, based on months of observing each person's strengths and working styles. But, more than that, they came from her experience in similar situations where getting the job done meant putting the right people in the right positions regardless of ego or conventional hierarchies. "What about operational command?" Williams asked. "Phillips is senior, but he's not deploying with us." Sarah looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze directly. "I'll be taking operational command for this mission. I have the most relevant experience, and, frankly, this situation requires someone who's done this before." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions, but also with a kind of relief. All of them had sensed that they were walking into something beyond their training experience, and having someone take charge who clearly knew what she was doing removed a layer of uncertainty that had been weighing on everyone. "Any questions about chain of command?" Sarah asked. "Just one," Jackson said. "How do we know you're qualified to make those kinds of decisions?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah walked to the tactical display and began outlining an approach to the facility that demonstrated intimate knowledge of hostage rescue protocols, industrial site assault tactics, and the kind of detailed operational planning that only came from extensive real-world experience. Primary approach through the maintenance sector to avoid security cameras. Two-man teams for building clearing with overlapping fields of fire. Communications protocol that maintains contact without compromising operational security. Contingency planning for chemical hazards, structural collapse, and civilian casualties. She worked through the plan with the fluidity of someone who'd done this dozens of times, answering tactical questions and adjusting approaches based on real-time intelligence updates. By the time she finished, there was no question about her qualifications to lead the mission. "Any other questions?" she asked, and, when no one responded, she nodded curtly. "Good. Gear up and prep for insertion. We leave in 15 minutes. As the team scattered to make final preparations, Thompson approached her with an expression of curiosity mixed with respect. "You really have done this before," he said. "More times than I'd like to count," Sarah replied, checking her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who knew that overlooking details could be fatal. "But this time feels different." "How so?" Sarah paused in her equipment check, considering how much she could safely reveal. "Usually, I'm working with people who've been doing this as long as I have. People who understand the rules and the risks and the costs. This time, I'm responsible for people who are essentially stepping into combat for the first time." "You think we're not ready?" "I think you're as ready as anyone can be without actual experience. But there's a difference between being ready and being seasoned. My job is to make sure that difference doesn't get any of us killed." Thompson nodded slowly, understanding the weight of responsibility she was carrying. "What do you need from us?" "Trust my decisions, follow orders immediately, and don't try to be heroes. In situations like this, the team that works together goes home together. The team that doesn't." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone understood what was at stake, and everyone understood that they were about to find out exactly how much their training had prepared them for the real world. The helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying a team of newly minted SEALs toward their first real mission under the command of someone whose true identity and experience remained largely hidden from them. But, as the aircraft banked toward the target site, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with operational focus. Whatever this mission really was, whatever larger purpose it served, she had a job to do and people to protect. And she'd be damned if she was going to let politics or hidden agendas compromise either objective. The helicopter descended toward the landing zone 2 miles from the gas facility as Sarah made final communications checks with her team. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the industrial complex glowing with artificial lights against the desert landscape. Too many lights for a facility that should have been running on minimal power during a hostage situation. "Command, this is Alpha Team," she spoke into her headset. "We're observing unusual lighting patterns at the target. Request confirmation on facility status." The response crackled back through static. "Alpha Team, intelligence indicates normal lighting may be part of the militants' strategy to mask their positions. Proceed with insertion as planned." Sarah felt the familiar itch between her shoulder blades that meant something wasn't adding up. In her experience, terrorists holding a gas facility didn't waste resources keeping unnecessary lights burning. They certainly didn't make themselves easier targets by maintaining normal operational lighting during a siege. "Team, sound off," she ordered as the helicopter touched down. "Thompson, ready. Jackson, good to go. Williams, set. Rodriguez, standing by." They moved away from the aircraft with the smooth coordination that months of training had burned into muscle memory. Sarah took point, her weapon ready and her mind processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Wind direction, ambient noise levels, sightlines, and escape routes all factored into her tactical awareness as they approached the facility. The industrial complex was massive, covering nearly 50 acres with a maze of pipes, storage tanks, and processing buildings. Perfect terrain for ambush, terrible terrain for rescue operations. If militants really had taken the facility, they'd chosen their battleground well. "Alpha Team, we have eyes on the perimeter," Sarah reported as they reached their observation point. "No visible security patrols, no movement in the guard towers. Something's not right here." Through her scope, she could see into several windows of the main administrative building where the hostages were supposedly being held. What she saw made her blood run cold, but not for the reason she'd expected. The people inside weren't bound or guarded. They were sitting around tables with coffee cups and paperwork, looking more like they were attending a late-night meeting than being held captive by armed terrorists. Several were checking their phones casually, and one appeared to be laughing at something someone else had said.
Command, Alpha Team.
I need immediate clarification on hostage status.
The people in the main building do not appear to be under duress.
Alpha Team, maintain position and continue reconnaissance.
Intelligence may be incomplete.
Sarah switched to the team frequency, keeping her voice low. Jackson, take Williams and circle to the east side. Rodriguez, you're with Thompson on Overwatch.
I want eyes on every building before we move.
As her team spread out, Sarah continued observing the facility with growing certainty that everything they'd been told was either wrong or deliberately misleading. The more she watched, the more convinced she became that this wasn't a hostage situation at all. Team leader, this is Rodriguez, the voice crackled in her earpiece.
I've got movement in the maintenance building, but it's not militants.
Looks like facility security conducting some kind of equipment check.
Williams here.
East side is clear, but I'm seeing normal shift change procedures at the main gate.
This doesn't look like a facility under siege.
Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Instead of proceeding with the assault plan, she ordered her team to maintain overwatch positions while she conducted a more thorough reconnaissance. What she discovered over the next 20 minutes confirmed her suspicions.
The facility was operating normally.
The supposed hostages were attending a routine night shift safety briefing. The militants were either nowhere to be found or had never existed in the first place.
Command, Alpha Team, she reported with ice in her voice. There is no hostage situation at this facility.
Repeat, no hostages, no militants, no threat. This appears to be a normal industrial operation conducting routine night shift activities. The pause that followed was long enough to confirm what she'd already suspected. This entire operation had been fabricated, designed to test her and her team under what they believed were real-world conditions. The question was whether the test was authorized by people who knew who she really was, or if something more sinister was at play.
Alpha Team, maintain position. We're reassessing the intelligence. Negative, Command. We're extracting immediately.
This operation is compromised, and I won't risk my team's lives or careers on a fabricated scenario.
Sarah switched back to team frequency. All units, this is team leader. We're extracting now.
Move to Rally Point Alpha and prepare for immediate extraction.
What's going on?
Thompson's voice carried confusion and concern.
Did the situation change?
I'll explain once we're clear. Right now, we need to get away from this facility before someone decides to make this scenario more realistic than it already is.
As they moved away from the complex, Sarah's mind was working through the implications of what they discovered.
If this had been an authorized training exercise, it would have been presented as such from the beginning. The fact that it had been disguised as a real emergency suggested either a breakdown in communication or a deliberate deception.
Neither possibility was acceptable.
They reached the extraction point to find their helicopter waiting, but, instead of the pilot they'd arrived with, Sarah recognized the figure in the cockpit as someone she'd worked with before. Someone from her actual unit, not from the SEAL Training Command.
Martinez, the pilot called out as they approached. We need to talk.
Sarah ordered her team to wait at a safe distance while she approached the aircraft. The conversation that followed lasted only a few minutes, but it answered most of the questions that had been building in her mind since the mission began. Your cover's blown, the pilot told her without preamble.
Someone in the Pentagon leaked information about your assignment to people who shouldn't have it.
This whole exercise was designed to expose you and compromise your real mission.
Who authorized the leak? Still working on that.
But the order came from high enough up the chain that someone with serious access is involved.
Your unit commander wants you extracted immediately.
Sarah looked back at her team, who were watching the conversation with obvious concern. These were good people who trusted her leadership and followed her into what they'd believed was a combat situation. They deserved better than to be used as pawns in whatever political game was being played at levels far above their understanding. I need 5 more minutes, she told the pilot.
I owe them an explanation.
She walked back to where her team was waiting, their faces reflecting the confusion and tension of a mission that had gone sideways in ways they couldn't comprehend. These men had followed her orders without question, had trusted her judgment when everything seemed wrong, and had performed exactly as she'd trained them to perform. "Sit down," she ordered, and, when they complied, she took a breath and made another decision that would change everything about how this night ended.
"My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez.
For the past 8 years, I've commanded a classified special operations unit that conducts missions the regular military can't handle. I was sent to SEAL training as part of a cover assignment that required official certification for an upcoming operation."
The silence that followed was complete.
Jackson's mouth was actually hanging open, while Thompson looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit any of his assumptions about how the world worked.
"The mission tonight was fake," she continued.
"There were no hostages, no militants, no threat. Someone used all of us as part of a test or trap that I'm still trying to understand.
But what I do understand is that you performed exactly as you should have.
You followed orders, maintained discipline, and trusted your team leader even when things didn't make sense."
"You're actually a lieutenant commander?"
Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Yes. I outrank everyone at the training facility, including the base commander.
I've been operating under cover for months, and tonight someone tried to blow that cover for reasons I'm still investigating." Rodriguez shook his head slowly.
"This is insane. You're telling us we've been training alongside someone who's already everything we're trying to become?"
"More than that," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "You've been training alongside someone whose real job requires capabilities that go beyond standard SEAL operations.
Someone whose next mission involves threats that could affect national security."
The weight of what she was telling them settled over the group like a physical presence. They'd signed up to become SEALs, which they understood was serious business. But they'd suddenly discovered they were involved in something that operated at levels they'd never imagined.
"So what happens now?" Jackson asked. "Do we go back and pretend tonight never happened?"
"You go back and complete your training," Sarah replied. "You earn your SEAL qualifications and you serve with the honor and distinction you've already demonstrated. As for tonight, you'll be debriefed by people with much higher clearances than mine, and you'll sign paperwork that makes it very clear that discussing any of this could result in charges of treason." She stood up, shouldering her gear with movements that now clearly revealed the professional competence they'd been observing for months. Everything about her posture and bearing spoke of someone accustomed to command authority and operational responsibility. "But before any of that happens, I want you to know that serving alongside you has been an honor. You're going to be exceptional SEALs, and I'm proud to have been part of your training, even under these circumstances." Thompson stood as well, extending his hand with an expression of respect that bore no resemblance to his earlier skepticism.
"It's been an honor serving under your command, ma'am. Even if we didn't know that's what we were doing."
The others followed suit, each of them offering handshakes and words of respect that carried genuine meaning. These were men who now understood they'd been part of something much larger than they'd realized, and who had risen to the challenge without knowing how high the stakes actually were. As Sarah walked back toward the helicopter, she felt the weight of command responsibility settling around her shoulders once again. The SEAL training had been a brief respite from the pressures of her real job, a chance to work with people who saw her as just another trainee trying to prove herself. But that chapter was closing, and the next phase of her actual mission was about to begin. Someone had compromised her cover assignment, which meant someone knew about operations that were classified at the highest levels of government. That knowledge in the wrong hands could endanger national security and get people killed. "Ready for extraction?" the pilot asked as she climbed into the helicopter. "Ready," Sarah confirmed, taking one last look at the team she was leaving behind. They were standing at attention as the aircraft lifted off, maintaining military bearing even though their world had just been turned upside down. The helicopter banked toward the base, carrying Sarah back to a reality that involved briefings with Pentagon officials, operations that officially didn't exist, and responsibilities that required her to operate in shadows most people never knew existed. But, as the lights of the gas facility disappeared behind them, she found herself thinking about the men she'd trained with and the lessons they'd all learned about assumptions, respect, and the complex nature of service in the modern military. They'd started as strangers who doubted her capabilities based on prejudices about gender and physical appearance. They'd ended as teammates who understood that competence came in many forms and that true leadership was about earning respect through performance rather than demanding it through rank or position. The irony wasn't lost on her that they'd learned those lessons from someone whose true identity had been hidden from them the entire time. But perhaps that made the lessons more valuable, not less. They'd learned to recognize excellence when they saw it, regardless of where it came from or whether it fit their preconceptions. As for Sarah herself, she'd been reminded of why she'd chosen special operations as a career path. Not for the adrenaline or the recognition, but for the opportunity to work with exceptional people who were willing to put service above self and mission success above personal comfort. The helicopter touched down at a secure airfield where black SUVs waited to transport her to briefings that would determine the next phase of her career. But, as she gathered her gear and prepared to return to the classified world that was her true calling, she carried with her the memory of months spent with people who'd proven that honor and competence transcended all the surface-level differences that seemed so important until real challenges arose. The scoffing in the locker room felt like it had happened years ago rather than months. The men who'd made those comments had learned to see past their assumptions, while Sarah had been reminded that leadership wasn't about proving superiority but about bringing out the best in everyone around you. Now it was time to apply those lessons in an arena where the stakes were measured not in training scores or graduation rates, but in the safety and security of the nation she'd sworn to protect.